In this lesson, I'm going to be teaching you sentence structure number 7 and 8. Remember, these are great ways to take boring sentences in your writing and spice them up with much more interesting sentences. These two are a little advanced, so make sure you're taking good notes. So first, take a look at this guy and write a simple sentence about him. Give him a name and have him do something. And if you don't know who he is, and you probably don't, you can make up a name for him. And while you're doing that, let me tell you who he is. His name's Rasputin, and I love this guy. He's crazy. Um, so the Russian czars, they were like the kings of Russia before World War One and before the communist government took over. And right before they fell out of power, the czar and his family kind of became friends with this guy Rasputin, and he was kind of like a monk, but he was kind of like a wandering guy, and he had this crazy long beard, um, and he was able to heal their son, like through prayer, and so they thought he was really great, and they gave him all this power in the government, and the nobles didn't like that, and so they decided they need to get rid of him, and they decided to kill him, and the craziest thing was that they like poisoned him and it didn't work, and then they shot him and he woke back up and attacked them, and they had to shoot him like three more times, and they threw him in the river, and even then when they found him later he had water in his lungs as if he survived like four gunshots. The guy was insane, and so uh, he's just a kooky figure from history, and I like learning about him. So now here comes the part of the lesson. We're going to add a noun part plus ing verb. What we're going to do is that sentence, that simple sentence that had your person doing something, we're going to pick a little part of that person and add an ing verb. So if my simple sentence about him is the man flexed for the crowd, well, I'm going to pick one important part of that sentence where he's flexing, and I'm going to pick his muscles. That's the noun part. And then I'm going to add an ing verb. What are those muscles doing? They're bulging. So muscles bulging, comma, the man flexed for the crowd. If I write Albert stepped into the bright sunlight, I'm going to pick an important part about him stepping into the sunlight, and I'm going to make it his eyes. Now, what are his eyes doing when he steps into the bright sunlight? They're blinking rapidly. So his eyes blinking rapidly, comma, Albert steps into the bright sunlight. And if I say Buddy dragged himself home, well, let's pick an important part of him and his body as he's dragging home, and let's pick his legs. And what are his legs doing? They're growing weak. So legs growing weak, comma, Buddy dragged himself home. So try it out yourself. Write a boring sentence. Pick an important part of the subject. If the subject's a person, a piece of their body, and then I add an ing verb. Okay. So a little hint: if you name your subject, mention the name in the second half of the sentence, in the simple sentence part, because you're going to just pick a piece of their face or body uh, for the front part. So notice Jim watched television for the first time. I'm going to mention his name in the main clause. Now, when I picture Jim watching television, what's the most distinctive piece? His eyes. So eyes bulging, comma, Jim watched television. Don't make it Jim's eyes bulging, comma, he watched television. That's not as elegant. And just like with all of our other sentence structures, we're going to put a comma after the noun part plus ing. Okay. Now here comes another example. And so look at this guy, give him a name, and write a simple sentence about him. And who is this? This is O. Henry. He's the one who wrote the Retrieved Reformation that we did our mock trial about. He also wrote one of my favorite Christmas stories called The Necklace, and maybe we'll get a chance to read it before Christmas. But it's a great story. So this is O. Henry. So give him a boring, simple sentence, and we're going to spice it up with another noun part plus ing. So when I look at him, and if I gave him the name Chip, and Chip thought about Buffy, what piece of his face is most distinctive as he's thinking? Well, it's his eyebrows. And so brows, that's the noun part, the piece of the subject, the part of the subject. And then I add an ing verb, furrowing. So brows furrowing, comma, Chip thought about Buffy. Or his fingers tapping and teeth grinding, comma, Clark waited for Lois. You see what I did there? I actually put two noun parts plus ing verbs. And you can do that. And look how much more interesting that sentence is. Compare it to Clark waited for Lois. That's really boring. But look how much more interesting it is when I focus on the tapping fingers and grinding teeth. Okay? So that's sentence structure number 7. Take your simple sentence, pick out a piece of the subject that's distinctive, and then add an ing verb. Okay, now let's look at sentence structure number 8. Make sure you label this clearly in your notes. Okay, so look at this guy and write a boring sentence about him. Well, this guy is Martin Luther, and Martin Luther was a monk, and he lived during the 1500s. And at that time, the Catholic Church, which was the only church around, was getting a little off track. They were selling forgiveness of sins and selling pieces of paper that could get you into heaven. And Martin Luther he was reading his Bible and he just said, you know what? That's really not how it should be. And so he wrote some statements. Those are called the 95 Theses. He nailed them to the church door and it said, you know what? That's not how we get into heaven. God's grace through Christ's sacrifice and resurrection. That's how we get into heaven, and that's called the Protestant Reformation because he reformed the church, and that's why there's lots of different types of churches like Methodist and Lutheran and Protestant type churches, and not just Catholic churches, because he made a stand. So Martin Luther. And yes, Martin Luther King was named after him because Martin Luther King's dad was a minister and their whole family was ministers and they really liked Martin Luther. Okay, back to the lesson. So similar to the last one, we're going to take our boring sentence. We're going to pick out a piece of the subject. That's the noun part. And then we're going to add an ed verb. Okay. So the sentence will begin with a piece of the subject and then a verb that ends in ed. Okay, so my simple sentence is the man argued back. Well, when he's arguing, what's a distinctive piece of him? Well, his mouth. So I'm going to take his mouth and then I'm going to add an ed verb. His mouth filled with food, comma, the man argued back. And in my second sentence, Louis strolled down the street is the boring sentence. That's the simple sentence. That's the independent clause. Well, I'm going to pick out a piece of him and I'm going to pick out his hat. And then I'm going to follow it with an ed verb. The hat on his head tilted to the side, comma, Louis strolled down the street. See how much more interesting that sentence is? It's awesome. And then William looked nonchalant. Nonchalant is like he doesn't care. And when he's looking like that, what's a distinctive piece of him? I'm going to pick his legs. So legs crossed at the knee, comma, William looked nonchalant. All right. So this is the noun part plus ed verb. That's what we're going to call that. And it's a really great way to add detail and make your sentence sound smart.